Hello, I'm Guy Daniels, Director of Content at Telecom TV, and welcome to our Strategy Outlook series on service management and orchestration, the keys to Open RAN success. This is the second of three special programs in the series. Our first program looked at the emergence of Open RAN and the role of Cloud RAN. In this second program, we're going to take a close look at the market opportunities of Open RAN. And then we have a live show on Tuesday, November the 16th, where we will be taking questions from our audience. Well, joining me now from our London studio is Ray Lemaitre, Editorial Director at Telecom TV. Ray, there's a lot riding on the success of Open RAN and therefore a lot of interest in defining the market opportunities.
Yeah, absolutely, Guy. And that's why global technology research firm Omdia has reached out to a number of industry leaders to undertake research and analysis on the Open RAN space. And joining me now is James Crawshaw. He's a principal analyst at Omdia and he conducted this particular research. Hi, James. Now, would you say there is general industry alignment on Open RAN, or did you see variations in strategy or even outliers linked to Open RAN?
Thanks, Ray. I should point out I did the report in collaboration with a colleague, Remy Pascal. Don't want to take anything away from Remy. Yeah, it was a really interesting study. We interviewed 11 operators and got written responses from another 2 or 3. And they were a real mix, big tier one operators that have got very strong engineering and R&D functions, some smaller operators, some new entrants. So a real mix of capabilities and strategies, but all of them really interested in Open RAN. I'd say really of all of the companies we spoke with, there was only one that was a little bit more reluctant. Obviously, the sample is self-selecting. We spoke with companies who were willing to talk about the Open RAN subject. But as far as I'm aware, the sort of the naysayers on Open RAN in the operator community are fairly few and far between.
And in the media covering the topic of Open RAN, the main driver for operators looking to use Open RAN systems appears to be increasing vendor diversity. Is this what your research confirmed?
Yeah, absolutely. Everybody says the same thing, vendor diversity. But actually, what is the point of vendor diversity? Ultimately, it's about two things, I think. Reducing cost, that could be operating cost or the capital cost of the infrastructure. And secondly, it's about innovation. There is this perception, this feeling that many operators have that the market is too concentrated today. There's only a small number of vendors who can meet their needs, and that by lowering the barriers to entry and allowing new entrants to come along, smaller companies, you'll untap some new innovation that the market's not currently delivering. So really that's what they mean by vendor diversity, reducing cost and tapping into greater innovation.
Now, where are companies deploying their Open RAN trial and POC systems today? And is this also where they expect to deploy the technology commercially?
Well, typically they're sort of playing it safe. So, some of them are just doing very small field trials, and it's not a commercial service at all. Others are looking to deploy it commercially, and they're doing it, again, sort of cautiously by rolling it into low-risk locations, essentially rural locations where there aren't many users, and if the service is perhaps not as good as their existing RAN infrastructure, there won't be too many complaints. We're also seeing a lot of interest in deploying it in private networks, if you like, things like football stadium or sports stadium or other venues as an alternative to Wi-Fi. And I think the idea there is that those sorts of private networks, they can essentially get the infrastructure cheaper if they choose an Open RAN solution than if they try and build it using the existing integrated RAN solutions that you get from the big vendors today. So they're looking at private networks, for things like Stadia, and then I think some operators are starting to consider deploying it on a broader basis. They're looking, some operators surprisingly are looking at deploying it in urban locations, so rather than the usual rural locations. And ultimately, what all of the operators that we spoke to said was that their long-term plan is that all of their network will be Open RAN compatible. It will be a key condition for all of their RFPs. That doesn't mean that their network, all of the boxes, all of the different boxes in the architecture diagram will come from different vendors. They may well still be buying a solution that's pre-packaged and pre-integrated and turnkey from one supplier, but they will want all of the interfaces to be open, all of the interfaces that are defined by the RAN Alliance, so that they have that flexibility, so that they have that optionality to make a change, to do a swap out at some point in the future.
And in the course of your research, what did you find out about the importance of service management and orchestration, or SMO?
Yeah, so I think the big focus of the industry to date on Open RAN, where a lot of the excitement has been, is about the RICs, these two RAN intelligent controllers. There's one that's a sort of distributed controller that's called the near real-time RIC. And that's sort of taking some of the intelligence out of the baseband, or the base station, if you like, and allowing operators to buy essentially a dumber baseband that's more commodity-like, and get the intelligence for the algorithms of how you optimize the network, and purchase those separately and run those as applications, so-called XApps, on this near real-time RIC. And there hasn't been as much focus or attention in the industry, or at least in the media, about the upper layers in the architecture. So the service management and orchestration piece, which is effectively a sort of OSS for Open RAN, and its own RIC. So it also has a RAN intelligent controller that's centralized as opposed to the distributed one, and it's referred to as non-real-time. Although in reality, this sort of distinction of what's near real-time and non-real-time, it's a little bit arbitrary. And the non-real-time is anything that operates in control loops of more than a second. And frankly, if you talk to a RAN engineer today about something that's operating in a control loop of 5 seconds, to their mind, that would probably be near real time. So, if you're used to operating on control loops of 15 minutes, this non-real time RIC in the SMO is actually a pretty useful function, but something that's not as widely discussed in the industry. And hence, we thought it was an interesting topic to look into. And it turns out that operators are interested in it too. And so, they expect that the non-real-time RIC and the R apps that run on it will actually be some of the first applications that they use to optimize and automate their Open RAN systems, and that the X apps running on that near real-time RIC, that might be something that comes a little bit later.
And James, what did you find out about how operators will source their SMO systems? For example, do communications service providers see SMO as coming from their RAN vendors or maybe other suppliers, or do they want to build their own SMOs?
Some are thinking about building it themselves, so they're looking at open source projects like ONAP as a template that could be used in order to build an SMO. But most, I think, will turn to commercial solutions. They'll look for a solution that may well be partly based on open source projects like ONAP, but will be vendor hardened, and all of the sort of the guarantees of quality and performance that you expect when you pay for stuff. I think. Do they want it to be separate from the RAN vendor? Yes, very much. The whole idea, the whole ethos of Open RAN is that you're not just buying from one big vendor, a soup to nuts solution. So they will want to their selection process for the SMO will be completely independent of their RAM provider, of the company that's providing the distributed and centralized units and the radio units. That will be a different purchasing decision. It may end up that they end up buying from the same company, but the decision will be completely independent. That's what we're hearing from the operators.
Okay, excellent. Thanks, James. So we'll be speaking to you again shortly. So thanks for your answers to those initial questions. And very interesting findings there, Guy. This is all part of what makes Open RAN developments so interesting to track.
Yes, indeed, Ray. And it's moving so fast. And we'll continue our discussion with you and James in just a moment. But first, I'd like to bring in David Espadas, who is Global Product Marketing Lead, OSS, Network Automation, Analytics and Network Management at Ericsson, who is joining us from Stockholm. David, hello, and thanks for joining us on the programme today. I'd like to ask you first, David, what is the most important thing you learned from this research that James has just told us about?
One of the most important relevant things for us is the fact that even if we are at early stages of Open RAN deployments, CSPs have really high expectations for the SMO. They expect it to be the umbrella management and orchestration system for multi-technology and multi-vendor radio automation going forward, and extending even beyond the Open RAN scope into purpose-built and integrated RAN.
Well, as we heard from James, there's a lot of discussion at the moment between near real-time RIC and non-real-time RIC and XApps and RApps. What insights did you get from this discussion?
We think it's not actually a versus, but a with and for what. What we expect is both radio controllers collaborate when it's required towards solving customer problems, and that is in the end what will bring value to the customers. On that aspect, the research from Omdia shows very interesting insights on the different contexts in which RApps and the XApps will live. We think, based on the higher openness and standardization, that the non-real-time RIC and the RApps are maybe likely to be more relevant in the near future for every communication service provider currently working on its own definition of the RAN automation journey.
And David, the white paper discusses the creation of a development ecosystem for RApp and XApp developers. What do you think will make that successful?
Communication service providers are now relying on the openness of the new architecture to foster innovation and drive innovative use cases. And this expectation needs to be supported by the market leaders like us, for instance, going forward in the form of the appropriate software development kits, the SDKs, and some other tools to enable every potential application developer to create value with new and innovative automation use cases.
Well, thank you, David. And let me turn back to James now for a moment, because I want to pick up on the RIC aspect here and the development of the ecosystem. James, what did you find out about the timing of RApps and XApps? What are the important use cases that the customers expect from this technology?
In terms of use cases, people talked a lot about network slicing. Obviously, that's a major topic in the industry. Everybody's working out how to do it, how to orchestrate it, how to monetize it. The RApps are seen as one key tool in it's ensuring that those network slices meet a certain guaranteed bandwidth, latency, etc. RAN sharing was another use case that a number of operators talked about. So, the idea being that you could have the same infrastructure, essentially the same servers, but you would use separate software to the other operator. But you'd be operating on the same physical infrastructure, but have completely independent networks that you could scale up, scale down based on your particular customer needs. So those were some, and then there were lots of other topics that are similar use cases to what you'd have with any sort of RAN. So it could be massive MIMO optimization, beam optimization, things like that. Many of the RApps are a sort of extension of what you have today with self-organizing networks and the centralized self-organizing networks use cases. And essentially what we expect, what the operators expect, is that vendors will port those existing applications, those existing SON software into XApp and into RApp, that will run on the various different non-real-time RIC platforms that are out there, and hence the need for SDKs, as I think David mentioned earlier.
Thanks, James. And Ray, as you and I discovered during our recent Open RAN Telecom TV Summit, there is significant interest in what the RIC could bring to the evolution of the RAN, especially through the introduction of these third-party apps. Although it's very early days and there's still a number of practical issues for the industry to address.
Yes, early days for sure, Guy, but a good grasp of what the RIC platforms and associated apps can enable is important right now, and the capabilities for developers need to be in place as soon as possible. So let me ask James. James, what did you find out about the expectation that SMO will enable RApp developer ecosystems? How important is the provision of software development toolkits, the SDKs, to enable these ecosystems?
Yeah, I mean, that's the ecosystem is the key word here. That sort of ties in with the vendor diversity aspect. What operators are hoping for is to buy an SMO, probably a commercial solution from one supplier. They may well choose the non-real-time RIC to come from a different company, and that will fit into their overall SMO architecture. And that non-real-time RIC will obviously be standards compliant, but will also have specific APIs, SDKs that that the RApp developers will need to write to. So they will. What this will lead to, I think, ultimately, is a small number of non-real-time RIC and near real-time RIC platforms existing. Similar, not perhaps as concentrated as you have in mobile phones with just Apple and Android. Perhaps there's room for more than two players, but there will be a sort of a platform play and economies of scale, which mean that there'll be far more XApp and RApp developers out there than there will be non-real-time and near real-time RIC platforms that win out.
Absolutely. And did the respondents you interviewed see SMO as a purely Open RAN component? Or is there an expectation that SMO software will support the existing RAN as well?
Yeah, absolutely. They don't want a siloed solution. They don't want to just have to manage an Open RAN network and have all of their existing legacy or integrated RAN or whatever you want to call it still operating under a completely separate management system. They want to have one umbrella management system, and logically, they are going to have to implement SMO as a new system. Logically, it makes sense for that to be the umbrella system that incorporates the existing network as well. But rather than the SMO talking directly with the network infrastructure in the way that it can communicate with the CU and DU in the Open RAN architecture, the SMO will probably talk to existing element management systems that are used in operators' existing RAN today, so at a sort of higher level than what it does in Open RAN. And so it'll talk through the EMS and sending instructions, sending configuration changes, and reading the data that it needs in order to make sure that the existing RAN is as optimized and automated as can be, and is able to continue serving customers well.
Okay, thanks, James. And let's turn back to David at this point. David, what would you highlight as the key takeaways from this research?
I would say first, the telecommunications community has really great expectations for the Open RAN SMO as primarily an enabler for innovation via the standard interfaces and the support of the RApp ecosystem. And second, this same community, the telecommunications community, is actually expecting support from multi-technology and multi-vendor, basically from day one. As James said, it's kind of the umbrella management and orchestration system for radio, for all technologies, all vendors. We really believe this openness will drive innovation going forward.
Thanks, David. It's going to be really interesting to see how this chapter in the Open RAN story develops during the coming year. Now, back to you in the studio, Guy.
Thank you, Ray. Well, we need to leave our discussion for now. Ray, James and David, thank you all very much for taking part today. This was the second programme in our series with Ericsson, and you can still watch the first, where Ray spoke to Sue Rudd of Strategy Analytics about the emergence of Open RAN and the role of Cloud RAN. And coming soon is our live program, and that's on Tuesday, November the 16th. Mark your calendars now. We have a packed program in store for you. And here's Justin Paul from Ericsson to tell us what we can expect to see. Goodbye for now.
Thank you, Guy. I think we've got a really exciting program lined up. Firstly, we've got a live panel session where we'll have Ericsson's Pio Lito, BT's Neil McRae, and Omdia analyst James Crawshaw, all talking about the area of service management and orchestration. We'll have some interesting technology deep dives, and we'll also have two software companies, Infovista and Viavi, talking about the role of SDKs and the development of our apps. And I think you'll find it's a really exciting program, a lot of insights to share with you, and please tune in. I look forward to seeing you then.
It's not only about what we can do with Cloud Run and Open Run, but it's also about how can we automate, how can we simplify the operations, or how can we solve the problems that they already have today.
We are the main driver for all these new components and the interfaces in the O-RAN Alliance today, so we are driving the standardization work. And at the same time, we are also preparing our products to be able to support these new components and open interfaces.